I'm Brian Berletic, and joining me, as usual, is Angelo Giuliano. Today, we're going to be talking all about U.S. encirclement of China. We have this proxy war going on in Ukraine between the U.S. and Russia. And as that is taking place, we have this conflict in the Middle East. And as I've constantly warned people, the U.S. ultimately has its sights set on China. This is the biggest problem for the ruling class of the United States seeking world hegemony. They want to stop the rise of China. So that is what we're going to be focusing on today. What are your beginning thoughts on all of this? Is the U.S. ultimately focused on China, or is this, or have everything been patched up after President Xi Jinping visited San Francisco recently?
Well, I think the problem is that it seems like the U.S. is overextending. There are different fronts. We have already two fronts. We have a front in Ukraine, and we see actually that there's upcoming defeat there. We see lots of media that are actually shifting their narratives. They're saying clearly, well, it's just a matter of time for Ukraine to lose. And then there's a possible second front in the Middle East. And we see the U.S. is being attacked in different places in Iraq and in Syria. I think we overlook a little bit this. What they're worried is to be completely kicked out of the Middle East. So if you have an air carrier there in the Middle East, it's not only for Israel. I doubt that the U.S. would intervene in Israel, but they're very worried to be completely kicked out of the Middle East. And then they're still active in China. So we see actions, especially I think the most worrying is the Philippines, this radical shift from Duterte. Duterte he had a balanced approach with China. He was actually rather pro-China. And we had this surprise because Marcos was the protege of Duterte. And we all thought that the opposition was more dangerous. The opposition was basically controlled by NED, very pro-US, and we end up with Marcos, who's very anti-Chinese. He's actually inviting the US to build up US army bases. And we can see on the map, those US army bases are extremely close to Taiwan. And I'm afraid that Philippines is looking more and more like another Ukraine.
So we have the map up, China obviously here in the middle, and we can see the United States. These dots are U.S. military presences around the region, not necessarily bases, but what we do know is the U.S. has multiple bases in South Korea and Japan, where tens of thousands of troops. You can see the numbers here. This is a little bit old because they also show U.S. troops in Afghanistan, but this gets the main point across. The United States is building a military presence all around China from Central Asia all the way to East Asia and everywhere in between. They have not so much a big military presence in most of Southeast Asia. Most of these countries, again, as we pointed out many times, you and I, Angelo, most of Southeast Asia counts China as their largest trade partner, infrastructure partner, source of tourism, source of investment, and increasingly source of even arms sales. So Thailand, a lot of people believe Thailand, where I am based, is very pro-American. But in reality, they have been replacing almost all of their old American hardware with new Chinese weapon systems, everything from main battle tanks up to submarines and surface vessels. But the U.S. is getting this foothold in the Philippines, as you mentioned, Angela. We also notice in Myanmar, the U.S., and I put on the screen earlier in this stream, someone who pointed out that the U.S. is behind this armed uprising in Myanmar. They're behind all of these ethnic groups and also political opposition groups that are now armed and fighting the central government. And they fight amongst themselves over ethnic issues and political issues, but they all also are compelled to fight the central government. This is what the U.S. supports them in doing. This has been going on for decades. The fighting has escalated in the last couple of years after a military coup ousted Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been built up, again, for decades by the United States. So let's actually before we get into that, I want to refresh everyone's memory. So we're looking at this map, and we see we know the U.S. is trying to use India as a counterweight against China, and also now Russia, and it's not really working out at all. Also in Pakistan, we've talked about how U.S.-backed insurgents are attacking Chinese infrastructure projects, killing Chinese workers, killing Pakistani security forces. So that's South Asia. And we see in Southeast Asia, the U.S. meddling and attempting to create a united front there. And of course, we have East Asia, South Korea, Japan, and Philippines as part of Southeast Asia. So let's look at this. I want to bring this up and point this out. This is from all the way back in 1965. We've talked about this many times, and I want to cover some parts that I haven't actually read before. It says, but let's start with the main points. They're talking about bombing North Vietnam and deploying U.S. troops to Vietnam, and they said this is only going to make sense if it is in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And then it says China looms as a major power threatening to undercut our importance and effectiveness in the world, and more remotely but more menacingly, to organize all of Asia against us. And so what is their counter to that? Is to organize all of Asia against China. And that is what they have been doing from actually before 1965 all the way up to and including right now, regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who is in Congress. And then it says they're talking about this long-run U.S. policy. It's based on an instinctive understanding in our country, the United States, that the peoples and resources of Asia could be effectively mobilized against us by China or by a Chinese coalition, and that the potential weight of such a coalition could throw us on the defensive and threaten our security. But they don't mean homeland security. They mean all of their meddling thousands of miles from their own shores. And it even kind of points that out. It says, we would move toward economic well-being, toward open societies. By that, they mean open up other countries so they can plunder them, toward cooperation between nations. The role we have inherited and have chosen for ourselves for the future is to extend our influence and power to thwart ideologies that are hostile to these aims and to move the world as best as we can in a direction we prefer. So they prefer to move the world in a direction that they want, regardless of what anyone else wants. And if you have an ideology or a sense of sovereignty and you want to determine your own destiny, they're going to fight. They're going to fight back against you, and they're going to undermine you. And then the important part, there are three fronts to a long-run effort to contain China, realizing that the Soviet Union contains China to the north, which it no longer does. Japan, Korea front, the Indian, Pakistan front, and the Southeast Asian front. And this map from recent years reflects this policy articulated all the way back in the 1960s.
Yeah, I think it's important just to go back at how imperialism has been working in the transition. We use people have the concept of imperialism as the old concept was you have army, they go, you have boots on the ground, and you start controlling the country. And then there's been transitions, and I think one of the main transitions, like milestone and transition was. With when they changed from a CIA covert operation to NED, National Endowment for Democracy. So basically what you do is you are going much softer. You hijack civil society, and slowly you penetrate democracy and you hijack the democracy. And I think this process is becoming more and more subtle. It goes into like the sovereignty, which is information space. What they do right now is most of those politicians are pre-selected by the collective West. And when we touch, you and I, we touched Myanmar. Myanmar is so obvious. It was so easy. Aung San Suu Kyi, she was British. She was completely British education. She was working for the West, and she was surrounded by foreign advisors.
White guys, literally just white guys from the UK, from Australia, literally in her inner circle running her policies. Yes, Angela.
Exactly.
Continue.
So we need to look at always the background. Where does this person come from? Was it pre-selected, and so on? And that's what we look at. We look at those pre-selection, media, financing NGOs and the level of penetration of those NGOs, which I mean, it's called non-government organization. I mean, they are government. They are funded by government. It's funny that they call them a non-government organization. And we see all around China, we can analyze one country at a time, Philippines, Thailand, Myanmar. There's been huge meddling. There's only a few countries that managed to do well and to protect their sovereignty.
Everyone needs to keep in mind the fact that the U.S. is committed to encircling and containing China for decades, and what happens when the U.S. uses a country as a battering ram against one of its chief adversaries. So when we talk about Myanmar or the Philippines or Taiwan, they are going to burn them to the ground just like they did Ukraine. There is no example of a successful U.S. client state that is thriving and advancing. There is no such thing. That is a myth. By now, that should be obvious to everyone. So I want to start actually with what's going on in Myanmar. I've had many people in the comment section ask, what's going on. I hear about the rebels taking over and the army is on the defensive. We can't actually get a very clear picture of what exactly is going on. I have reliable contacts that send me information. They say that, yes, these rebels are fighting heavily in the north, along the border between Myanmar and China, and they are trying to cut off the trade routes between Myanmar and China. And I just want to show people how important China is to Myanmar. So here is Harvard University's Atlas of Economic Complexity. This is where Myanmar exports to. So China, obviously huge, and then the rest of Asia second, and then everyone else is almost negligible. And then in terms of imports, again, China, massive. Thailand, its next door neighbor, very important import sources of imports. And so over the years, and this was 2022, this was last year, China is including Myanmar in its Belt and Road Initiative. There's pipelines, there's dams, there's ports being built by China in Myanmar. This benefits Myanmar, obviously. It also clearly benefits China. And what are these U.S.-backed militants doing? They're literally attacking the joint infrastructure projects that Myanmar's central government has built with China. So this was China-backed pipeline facility damaged in Myanmar resistance attack. We also remember when the escalation first began, they went around burning Chinese factories as well. So they're complaining about the government and they want democracy, but then all they do is attack Chinese factories, Chinese infrastructure projects, which don't represent their own best interests. It represents what Washington would love to do. If they could just do anything without consequence, they would bomb Chinese infrastructure everywhere, just physically blow up the Belt and Road Initiative, but they can't, so they use proxies to do it. So that's what they were doing. This is a little more recent. One of my contacts actually sent me this, and they were talking about how the coup in 2021 that ousted Aung San Suu Kyi and her literal white guys, inner circle of white guys, they began establishing these trade routes and rail projects with China, to and from China, to the port here in Rakhine State. That was where the U.S. was stirring up trouble between the Rohingya and these ultra racist followers of Aung San Suu Kyi. They constantly blamed it on the army, which is not blameless, but it was primarily Aung San Suu Kyi's followers that were brutalizing the Rohingya. And they were doing that specifically because that is exactly where China was trying to build the port. They were trying to destabilize that region and prevent that construction. That is what the U.S. is doing. And that is what most of the, yes, someone just said, just like Nord Stream 2, where the U.S. did actually just literally blow it up. That's where they are right. That's the place the United States is right now. And they have all of these smoke screens about why they're fighting, why they have to confront Russia and China, but it really is because they don't want to lose control of the planet. They will literally blow up these projects to keep everyone artificially dependent on them. Okay, so these trade routes, and so what are these rebels doing? They're trying to cut the trade routes. So this was from Global Times. This is Chinese media. And this was just from November 25th. PLA conducts real combat drill along China-Myanmar border, a necessary act to deal with emergencies, potential escalation. Experts, and they're talking about the militants conducting attacks all along the border and cutting these routes, and how serious this is, and it threatens to drag China into it, just like the U.S. destabilized Ukraine and dragged Russia into Ukraine. Now they're trying to do something very similar in Myanmar.
Maybe if you can go back to the map, I think would be interesting for the viewers just to look at what do they want to do, and especially there's a pipeline.
Yes,
there's a pipeline.
That's a very good point. Yes.
That pipeline, I think it's the former, when you saw the routes, and actually this is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. If you can get just a little bit closer, we can see actually what they were trying to do is just to cut this pipeline, which is extremely important for China because it bypasses the Malacca Strait. So you see China has to go all around to the Malacca Strait, and the Malacca Strait is very problematic for China because if China was to go into confrontation with the US, probably the US would use this Malacca Strait to do a blockade, probably similar to what they did to Japan during World War II. So you have those projects, and you have this very, very critical pipeline for China. And what they've been trying to do is just to destroy or actually to contain infrastructure projects. And I think you see, for example, there was this dam, a huge dam that they wanted to build. And Aung San Suu Kyi, what she was working on, and she had actually one advisor that was working close to her, and his single job was to work on just containing the project on the Belt and Road Initiative. When Aung San Suu Kyi, she was just elected, what they did, they sat down all the U.S. State Department. There was George Soros. They were like, probably BlackRock, all those banksters, because that's what they are. They are bankers, gangsters. They were actually talking about how are we going to plunder Myanmar. That's what they did. The first thing they did. So so you see, and that's the payback time. So I think I have the impression that what the military did was to close an eye on this. They were closing an eye, they let them do it, and then they knocked them out completely. They shut down everything, US aid, USAID, all those millions of dollars that were poured into a country which is extremely poor. Imagine USAID was putting $50 million just like this into Myanmar. When you have $50 million, you can hijack. How many people can you buy with $50 million? You are the king. Yeah. You control. Money is power, and that's how they do in the region.
Let's go and talk about the Philippines. I think, Angela, you sent me this Reuters article, how the U.S. courted the Philippines to thwart China. So you have to understand that even if you read this Reuters article, they're going to explain this has nothing to do with building the Philippines up. The Philippines has over 13 million people, and yet it has a smaller GDP than Thailand, which has about 70 million people. It had been a literal U.S. colony until 1946, and the U.S. has exercised to one degree or another political capture of the Philippines ever since, which is why for decades it has lagged behind the rest of Southeast Asia, despite having an overabundance of human resources and natural resources. So keep that in mind. This is what the Reuters article says. It says, America has rushed to mend relations with its former colony after ties frayed under former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. It has lavished attention on new leader Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and sent military equipment and vaccines. If you've ever been to the Philippines, these are the, and when they talk about, well, let's not talk about the V word, but these are things that the Philippines needs the least. They don't need military equipment. They don't need big pharma products from the United States. They need infrastructure. They need railways. They need roads. They need ports. They need factories. They need these things that makes a modern nation state thrive. The U.S. is offering none of this, absolutely none of this. It says Washington needs Manila in its camp as tensions with China rise in the Indo-Pacific. Reuters got inside the charm offensive. You could look up the title of this article. Maybe I'll put a list of the references in the video description afterwards. And then it's basically admitting that they're using the Philippines as a battering ram against China. It says the Philippines, Taiwan's neighbor to the south, so because this is all about Taiwan, would be indispensable staging point for the U.S. military to aid Taipei in the event of a Chinese attack. Military analysts say, and if there is a Chinese attack, it will only be because the U.S. provoked it. And we've talked about this, how the U.S. officially recognizes Taiwan as part of China, and yet is staging their own troops there, selling weapons to a separatist administration in Taipei. And it goes on and on, things that if any country did to the United States, it would be considered an act of war. And then it says China's ruling Communist Party views democratically governed Taiwan as an inalienable part of China and refuses to rule out force to bring the island under its control. And this is, again, this is just what Reuters always does. They lie about absolutely everything. And if you go to the U.S. State Department's own website, they're saying it's a democratically governed island. They try to make it out as if it's a country. But if you go to the State Department's official website right here, it says, we do not support Taiwan independence. And if you don't support their independence, it means they're dependent on someone. Who are they dependent on? China. They're part of China. Under international law, it is recognized as part of China. So here's Reuters depicting this as if China's just imagining that Taiwan is part of its sovereign territory. That's what Reuters does. That's what the Western media does. And then it says, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, is a pact signed in 2014 between the U.S. and the Philippines. It permits the U.S. military to access Philippine bases and strategic sites for joint training and to construct facilities such as runways, fuel storage, and troop housing. Troop housing for whose troops? The agreement was expanded in 2023 to allow the United States access to 9 locations, up from 5 previously. So we've talked about this previously, about the U.S. getting access to more Philippine bases and expanding the infrastructure, the military infrastructure there. And that says Reuters has been detailing the race between China and the United States to bulk up on advanced technologies that can determine who secures military and economic supremacy this century, and more specifically, who will have supremacy over Asia. China, the largest country in Asia, or the United States on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, nowhere near Asia. It seems obvious what's going on here. And they talk about aerial and sea drones, AI-controlled weapons, and cutting-edge surveillance are fast reshaping warfare with implications for the global balance of power. For the United States, cementing alliances in the Asia-Pacific region is likewise crucial to keeping China in check. The U.S. embrace of Marcos is key to that project. So again, it has nothing to do with the U.S. wanting to assist the Philippines. They are openly admitting this is about using the Philippines against China because the U.S. desires to control, contain, divide, and destroy China. That is what all of this is all about. And then when you point this out, there's this Angela pointed this out also. Press One is some fake fact-checking media organization in the Philippines, very nebulous about who actually funds them. And they're talking about pro-China narrative shared across various pro-China disinformation websites. And this is about an article that I wrote, and all I pointed out, and literally all I did was cite articles like this from Reuters about the U.S. gaining access to these bases. And this is another fact check where they are claiming that the U.S. is not building new military bases in the Philippines. And then when you actually read the details, they're playing semantics. The U.S. is building facilities in these bases. They're getting access to them, but they're not building brand new bases. But for the U.S., they are new bases. So they're playing a word game. Why are they doing that? The point I'm making here is they know what the U.S. is doing to the Philippines. They know how dangerous it is. They know if they explain it to the people in the Philippines, they would oppose this because it is turning the Philippines into another Ukraine. And if people understood that, they would oppose it. And that is the last thing they want. They want this to keep building momentum until the Philippines is in the process of being burned to the ground, just like Ukraine.
Whereas when it comes to the Philippines, I think it would be interesting to look at the trades of the Philippines. Does the Philippines export, and how dependent actually the Philippines are. I just checked just before the show. I checked if you can go back to 96. Actually, you can check. We can compare. Would be interesting that. So if you go back to 96, we can see the shifts. So here,
huge difference. Huge
United
difference.
States, they were doing 32.94%, and now we can see today how much is the shift. China was irrelevant, so China we need to add 20 plus 11%, because a lot of trades are going through Hong Kong. The single reason is because of it's a tax haven, so they're not going directly through China, but they actually leave some profit in Hong Kong. So you just add up those two positions, we are at 32%. If you look at the 14%, actually I checked the 14% of United States. You know what it is? It's IT services, it's call centers. I mean, that's what they do. So they could be completely dropped. They can ditch you overnight. It's not very valuable. When you are trading commodities, you're trading finished product. That's much more difficult to shift suppliers. So here you have this dependency of the Philippines. You have 32% of your trade. It's with China. You're shooting yourself into the foot. And the interesting part is that the US wants to have a presence in the region. The reason they claim it's because of freedom of navigation, but freedom of navigation, it is important for China and the Philippines, not so much for the US. You see, I mean, that's so important for the countries in the region.
And this is CSIS, is a U.S. government arms industry funded think tank, and even they admit that China, by far, it is their traffic, their trade going through these waters the U.S. supposedly wants to protect. And when the U.S. says protect, they actually mean threaten. The U.S. is there to threaten and, if possible, cut off Chinese trade in their own waters, off their own coasts. That is what the U.S. is actually doing. That is what the Philippines is a party to. And that's what I was trying to point out in my article. Just like Ukraine before 2014, their economy was semi-integrated with the Russian Federation. They did a huge amount of business with the Russian Federation. They share a border. They had been part of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire throughout history. They speak almost a common language. Half the population speaks Russian. And from 2014 onward, the U.S. installed a client regime that irrationally cut themselves off from Russia and completely destroyed Ukraine's economy. It's just been a downward spiral ever since. And that is what the U.S. is trying to do to the Philippines. It's what they're trying to do to countries all across Asia. Here in Thailand, they had candidates that openly said they were going to cancel infrastructure projects with China and pivot back to the U.S. and Europe and Japan, who don't have anything of equal value to offer Thailand. And the same goes for the Philippines, maybe more so. And as you point out, Angelo, most of the economic activity that the U.S. conducts with these countries, it's exploitative. It does not give them the infrastructure they need to be a thriving modern nation states. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. And also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It's not doing me any good at all. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you very much for that. And as always, thank you for watching.